Today's case is one of the first true crime rabbit holes I fell into when I was a teenager back in the early 2000s. And trust me, it's a crazy story. We're going all the way back to 1971 to talk about John List. John List was the man behind one of the most shocking family murder cases in U.S. history. In 1971, he murdered his entire family and then vanished, leaving the whole country wondering what had happened. His story remained unsolved for nearly 2 decades until he was finally caught in 1989, bringing an end to one of America's longest-running mysteries. John Emil List was born in September 1925 to his parents, John and Alma. As an only child growing up in a strict Lutheran household, church was a central part of family life. His father was a reserved, no-nonsense man who rarely showed emotion, and John took after him, becoming equally serious and closed off. People who knew him described him as robotic, rarely displaying any feelings. On the other hand, John's mother, Alma, wasn't just strict. She was extremely overprotective. She kept him on a tight leash, rarely allowing him to make friends or socialize. Alma's extreme protectiveness stemmed from her fear that the outside world would lead him astray or into sin, making John what many described as a mama's boy. While there's nothing wrong with being close to one's mother, Alma was practically his only friend. In his younger years, John was heavily involved in church activities and spending his free time at home reading the Bible. People who knew him then described him as quiet, socially awkward, and somewhat of a loner. As he got older, John joined the Army in 1944 during World War II, serving as a lab technician. His father passed away in 1945, leaving just him and Alma. After his military discharge in 1946, he attended the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, earning a bachelor's degree in business administration and a master's in accounting. John was clearly intelligent, especially with numbers, and he had a reputation for always dressing impeccably. He would wear a full suit even for mundane tasks like running errands or mowing the lawn. He was that guy who always dressed sharp, regardless of the occasion. Despite being polite, well-spoken, and generally nice, he remained shy and socially awkward. In 1950, John got called back into the military during the Korean War and was stationed in Virginia. While he was there, he joined a singles group at his church, where he met Helen, a beautiful Lutheran woman. Helen was a young widow with a daughter named Barbara. Tragically, her husband had been killed in the war. Introducing Helen to his mom made John super nervous. He had no idea how Alma would take it, especially since Helen already had a child. And for a lifelong mama's boy like John, this was a big deal. Plus, it was the 1950s, and people had different views on relationships back then, so John worried his mom wouldn't approve. Still, John and Helen kept dating. Eventually, Helen told John she was pregnant, which freaked him out a bit. For someone as religious as John, it seemed wild that he'd be getting intimate before marriage. But regardless, he married Helen to avoid the scandal of having a child out of wedlock. The kicker? Not long after they tied the knot, Helen admitted she wasn't actually pregnant. John felt trapped. He'd been raised to believe marriage was forever, so leaving wasn't even an option. Now he was stuck in a marriage based on a lie, with a wife he was already starting to resent and a stepdaughter he hadn't planned on raising. Years later, John found out that Helen had syphilis, which she'd contracted from her late husband. Back then, STDs like syphilis were pretty common among soldiers who commonly picked it up abroad. Helen's syphilis was at an advanced stage, and while John didn't catch it, the disease was slowly destroying her health. By 1952, John finally landed a steady accounting job in Detroit, which was a huge relief after struggling to hold down jobs for a while. He was smart and articulate, but he just couldn't keep a job long term. His quiet, self-doubting personality made him terrible at taking charge, and he couldn't handle the pressure of firing people or having difficult conversations. He'd just freeze up. Things were starting to look up in Detroit. Around the same time, Helen got pregnant, and they ended up having 3 kids together, Patricia, John, and Frederick. Helen's daughter Barbara, from her first marriage, eventually got married and moved out in 1960, leaving just John, Helen, and their 3 kids in the house. Not long after, they relocated to New York for a new job opportunity for John. He started climbing the ranks at his new gig and eventually became the director, which came with a bigger paycheck. With the extra cash flow, he and Helen decided to upgrade their lifestyle. Helen was especially excited about getting a bigger home and really pushed John to find something impressive. They ended up choosing this massive 19-room mansion complete with a full apartment on the third floor that even had its own kitchen. Basically, it was like a mini apartment inside the mansion. But John knew they couldn't afford this place on his salary alone, so he asked his mom for help with the down payment. In exchange, he promised her the third floor apartment. It seemed like the perfect setup. His mom would be close by, and they'd get their dream house. She agreed, and the whole family moved in. But around this time, Helen's behavior started to take a turn. Her syphilis was progressing and affecting her brain, showing up as early signs of dementia. She became unpredictable, had frequent outbursts, and stopped doing any housework. John had to step up and handle everything. He'd work all day and then come home to a messy house with kids who needed attention. Sometimes Helen would even call him at work to yell at him or demand he come home immediately to take care of things. There were times he actually had to leave work to go handle the chaos at home. Despite all this, John tried to keep everything together. He'd clean, take care of the kids, cook, and do whatever he could to maintain some order in the house. But his frustration with Helen kept building as her illness got worse. Her health was so bad that she'd spend most of the day in bed, only getting up for a quick snack or coffee before retreating to her room. Meanwhile, John stayed on his grind. He'd still mow the lawn in a full suit, take the kids to church, and keep up appearances. Neighbors noticed that he seemed almost too put together, like a guy who never let his emotions show. Helen was becoming more distant and unpredictable, and John was left holding everything together, desperately trying to keep up the image of the perfect family. But the emotional weight was crushing him. Then, in 1966, John lost his job. He was too embarrassed to tell anyone, and honestly, who could blame him? Things were already a total mess at home. Helen was dragging him emotionally, throwing his insecurities back in his face, and her health was falling apart too. So John decided to keep his job loss a secret from literally everyone: Helen, his mom, the kids, the whole family. Every morning he'd suit up, leave as if he were heading to work. He just faked it. He'd take the train, hang out at the station, nap on a bench, read the paper, and pretend like he still had a job. He kept that act going for a while. He tried to find new work, but nothing stuck. He kept losing gigs, and his financial world was falling apart, with money running out fast. Desperate, John started sneaking into his mom's bank account. How he managed to pull that off is still kind of a mystery, but she probably trusted him since he was her son. He siphoned off money just to keep the lights on and the bills paid. Meanwhile, the kids had no idea the whole house of cards was crumbling around them. By October 1971, after 5 years of pretending and sinking deeper into debt, the pressure cooker was about to explode. Even Helen and the kids started to notice that something was seriously off. The older kids, Patricia and John Jr., were juggling school and part-time jobs, handing over every penny they earned to their dad just to help keep the house running. John was especially stressed about his daughter Patricia. She had joined the drama club and was dead set on becoming a movie star, which freaked John out because he thought she was straying from God. The stress of everything had John spiraling hard. He became convinced that their poverty was some kind of divine punishment and that it was all his fault. In his mind, their financial mess was a reflection of his sins, and he believed that poverty equaled sin. Things got so twisted in his head that he thought the only way to save his family from hell was to send them to heaven while they were still pure. He even considered taking himself out of the picture, but he remembered that growing up, he had learned that unaliving himself was an unforgivable sin. So, in his warped logic, he convinced himself that to protect his family's souls, he had to do something unthinkable. In his mind, killing them was actually saving them from a sinful life. This messed up sense of duty drove him to plan the murders in detail, genuinely believing he was helping them get to heaven. How twisted. This guy thought he was saving his family from sin by killing them, thinking it would send them to heaven. As a former Baptist, I can tell you right now, killing not just 1 but 5 people is as sinful as it gets, and it straight up breaks the 6th commandment. So on November 9th, 1971, John followed his normal daily routine without missing a beat. He had breakfast with his kids, Patricia, John, and Frederick, acting like it was just another ordinary day. After they left, he went to the garage to prepare his guns, making sure to act as normally as possible so no one would get suspicious. He hung around, waiting for his wife to come downstairs for her morning coffee. When she finally came down, she boiled some water, made her first cup, and sat down to take a sip. John took a gun and shot her in the back of the head. Next, John headed upstairs to the third-floor apartment where his mom lived. He walked in and found her in the tiny kitchen, making toast and getting her coffee ready. She asked him about the loud noise she'd heard, and he replied, "Oh, it must have been something outside. That's why I came up." As she turned around, John shot his mother directly in the face. John then went back downstairs and, as carefully as possible, dragged his wife's body into the house's ballroom. He laid her out on a sleeping bag, then went upstairs to get his mom's body. However, he later claimed she was too heavy to carry down, so he left her in a sleeping bag upstairs. After trying to clean up the mess as best he could, he made himself a sandwich and sat down at the same table where he had just killed his wife.
The relief that this plot that I had was carried out without being interrupted. I more or less relaxed after that. Having been in combat, we were out killing and fighting, and then we'd come in and have something to eat. I think that's what allowed me to eat peacefully in the room that I had killed my family.
Over the next few hours, John ran errands to cover his tracks. He wrote letters to his kids' schools, explaining an extended absence. He visited the bank and closed both his and his mother's accounts, withdrawing $2,000. He put a hold on their mail, sent letters to his children's jobs, and contacted the milkman and newspaper delivery service, asking them to stop deliveries for a month as his family would be out of town. John made all the arrangements to ensure that no one would be checking on the family. Later that day, his 16-year-old daughter Patricia, the one who dreamed of becoming a movie star in Hollywood, came home from school and he shot her in the back of the head. He dragged her body, placed it in a sleeping bag, and moved it into the room next to her mother. Around this time, his 13-year-old son Frederick arrived home, and he shot him in the back of the head as well. He dragged Frederick's body into the room and placed it on a sleeping bag. So now all three of their bodies are laid in that room on sleeping bags while his mother's body remains upstairs. Now only one child was left, 15-year-old John Jr., who was still at school. John Sr. drove to the school and watched his son play in a soccer game, sitting in the bleachers and observing as his son played well and enjoyed himself. After the game, they drove home together. When they arrived, John Jr. walked inside and dropped his school bag on the counter. John then shot his son. While researching this case, I found a lot of conflicting information. Many articles, TV specials, and news stories reported that John Jr. fought back. However, John claimed in an interview that he believed his son's movements were a neurological response, as he was twitching.
With John, I don't know whether it was a muscle reaction that caused him to jerk around a little bit, but then I shot several more times.
John shot his 15-year-old son 10 times. John then made himself dinner and sat down to eat, even though his wife and 3 kids were lying dead in the ballroom and his mom was upstairs. When he was done, John felt a sense of relief. He spent the night in the house, later saying he actually slept better than he did the night before. The next morning, John woke up, set the lights to make it look like someone was still home. To try and preserve the bodies, he turned the heat down as low as it could go, cranked up some loud classical music, wrote a long letter for his pastor, explaining why he'd done it, thinking he'd saved his family from hardship and sin. Before leaving, he went around to every family photo, cutting out his own face so he wouldn't be recognized, which clearly was a waste of time because the police eventually retrieved photos of him. John then parked his car at JFK Airport, hopped on a bus, and was gone, making it seem like he had flown somewhere. The whole plan was seriously very thought out. John covered every detail, even notifying the school and other places about the family's supposed trip. A couple of weeks later, neighbors started to get suspicious when the lights in the house's bedrooms went dark one by one. But even then, the police didn't break in when they did a welfare check. Finally, on December 7th, nearly a month later, a drama teacher from the high school got worried and called the police. The teacher remembered something John's 16-year-old daughter had once told her. Patricia had told her she was scared her dad would kill the whole family. Apparently, John had weirdly talked to his family about how they prefer to die and whether they'd want to be cremated or buried. When the daughter shared this with her teacher, the teacher brushed it off as teenage drama, but after not hearing from the family for so long, she got nervous and called the police, even meeting them at the house. Upon entering, police were hit by freezing air and heard the eerie, loud classical music John had left playing. As they moved through the house, they eventually reached the ballroom and found the bodies laid out in sleeping bags. Realizing the tragic scene before them, they called for any signs of life, but got no response. They later found John's mother's body in a similar state upstairs. A nationwide manhunt for John List began. Police found his car in the airport parking lot, but since it wasn't unusual for travelers to leave vehicles there, they hadn't initially connected it to him fleeing. John had cleverly left by bus instead of by plane, putting him 2,000 miles away. By the time the search began after the murders, he had settled in Denver, Colorado, under a new name, Robert P. Clark. Somehow, he managed to retrieve a social security number and fully assume this new identity. He worked as a cook and built a life free from his past. The guilt didn't seem to weigh on him. "I was glad to be free," he later admitted. "I didn't want to be in prison if I could avoid it." In 1986, he remarried, left Colorado, and started working as an accountant in Richmond, Virginia. No one, not even his wife, knew who he really was. Back in Westfield, the memory of the murders never faded. Authorities worked relentlessly to find him, but hit dead end after dead end. Then, in 1988, investigators reached out to the TV show America's Most Wanted. Initially, they didn't want to feature the case. After some persuasion, they changed their minds to make their segment as compelling as possible. The show's producers reached out to Frank Bender, a forensic sculptor who specialized in creating age-progressed images of wanted criminals and unidentified bodies. His job was to figure out what John List might look like, almost 20 years after the murders.
I get into the head of the person. In a sense, I want to become that person while I'm working on the fugitive. I want to feel like that person. I want to know everything about that person.
On America's Most Wanted.
Now tonight's first case, the oldest we've ever pursued on America's Most Wanted.
After the episode aired, a woman and her daughter were watching and immediately called in a tip. Wanda Flannery, who lived in Denver, Colorado, recognized John List as looking eerily similar to her old neighbor, Bob.
Just all started adding up, that he was an accountant and a Lutheran, and that he had a scar behind his ear. He was well put together, classy dresser. By the time they got to the sculpture, and the clincher for me was the glasses and the jowls.
We said, "Oh my God, that's Bob."
The FBI moved quickly, and when they arrived at Clark's home, his wife was in shock, denying any connection. The FBI didn't waste time. They tracked John, aka Bob, down at his accounting job in Richmond on June 1st, 1989. Agents confronted him at work, took him into custody, and confirmed his identity through fingerprints. After almost 18 years, John List was finally caught. In 1989, List was brought back to New Jersey to face trial. His defense team argued that he was mentally unwell and obsessed with his strict values. However, the prosecution highlighted the deliberate planning he put into the murders, presenting a letter he had written to his pastor in which he accepted full responsibility.
Carry out the killings in a serial fashion. He did not want two of the family members to be present at the same time.
Sorry for the tragedy that happened in 1971. I feel that due to my mental state at the time, I was unaccountable for what happened.
The jury took 9 hours to find him guilty on all 5 counts, and he was sentenced to 5 life terms without parole. List attempted to appeal his sentence, claiming PTSD from his military service, but his efforts failed. In prison, he said he had made peace with his situation, though he still claimed he felt safer there than he would on the outside. The man who had escaped justice for 17 years was now in the very system he had tried to avoid. This case serves as a chilling example of how far some will go to dodge consequences and how a person can live undercover in a community without raising suspicion. His capture underscored the importance of public tips in bringing even the most elusive criminals to justice. Today, John List's story is often referenced in criminal psychology and true crime media as a case study of how someone can change their name and appearance, but not their true nature. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Let me know which case you want me to cover next. Remember to stay curious, stay safe, and stay skeptical.